right, everyone. Welcome back to the Algebraic Graph Theory Seminar. I want to wish everyone a happy International Women's Day, especially all the international women in the audience. I don't know how you qualify yourself as an international woman, maybe if you're living abroad. But yeah, really everyone. Today we have Joy Morris from University of Lethbridge, who's going to be telling us about lexicographic products and wreath products and generalizations. So I will let her take it away. And Joy, you may need to unmute yourself. Maybe I can unmute you. Are you with us, Joy? One moment. Joy? Oh no, can she not hear?
Okay.
There we go.
Sorry. So let me try that again. Sorry. So I want to give a fairly expository talk, I hope, about lexicographic products, which are one of the fairly standard types of graph products that we learn a lot about, and that we study quite a bit, and how these have developed and our understanding of them has developed along with automorphism groups, their automorphism groups, and how those thoughts interact, those ideas interact. There's quite a bit about infinite graph theory that's important in this development, and I'm not at all an infinite graph person, but hopefully I will be able to make those parts understandable nonetheless. So let me begin by saying I'm at the University of Lethbridge, which is down here. Oops. Down here, pretty near to the US border. It's a small university with about 10,000 undergraduate students and a pretty small graduate program. So I've structured my talk according to sort of the main people who have worked on this particular aspect of the problem. So I'll begin with some discussion of the work of Frucht and Harari, and then I'll move into some discussion about Sabidussi, and then Hemminger, and then I'll talk a little bit about a paper that I wrote with Ted Dobson about 10 years ago around this, and I'll move into some very recent work of other people right at the end if I have time. So to begin with, well, Harari really began it, but Frucht, he was motivated by Frucht. So let me talk about what Frucht did in 1949 in the Bulletin of the AMS. Frucht looked at what the automorphism groups of what he called repeated graphs look like. And a repeated graph is a disjoint union of k copies of a graph. So as you can imagine, you can permute these k copies around any way you like, using a symmetric group, and then you can use the automorphism group of the graph independently on each of the individual copies. And that's basically what he said in this article. Motivated by this, in 1959, in the Duke Journal of Math, Harari introduced what he called the composition of graphs. So his motivation, as he described it, was to construct a binary operation on linear graphs to be called composition, such that the group of the composition of two graphs is in generally permutationally equivalent to the composition, or Polya's Gruppenkranz, of their groups. This problem was suggested by the work of Frucht, who gave the result for the case that the first graph in the composition is totally disconnected, has no edges. So that's what I just mentioned. So the Gruppenkranz, or composition, or as it's called nowadays, the wreath product of two groups. Let me first tell you what that is. So I'm going to specifically tell you about the wreath product of permutation groups. It can be defined for arbitrary abstract groups, but that's more complicated and not particularly useful when we're talking about permutation groups anyway. It's a lot more intuitive with respect to permutation groups. So here's how Harari defined the Gruppenkranz. He called this the composition or Gruppenkranz of the permutation groups G1 with G2, and this is the notation. The object set is the direct product of the sets on which the two individual groups are acting. But he likes to think of it as the object set as being a matrix with the columns and rows indexed by the two sets. And the elements of the composition then are the permutations of the matrix that are defined by, we permute the rows in accordance with any element of the first group, and permute the column indices in each row individually using whatever element you choose of the second group for each row independently. Okay, so key points here to realize are that this operation preserves the rows as sets. So each row, any row maps to a row. Each row might get mixed up in its own entries might get mixed up, but rows have to map to rows. And let me mention, because I'll be using this notation later, the more modern notation looks like this. So G1 wreath G2. This is the notation that we use. Okay. So now he defined the graph, the composition of two graphs. And this is the word description. So we take the first graph gamma 1 and the second graph gamma 2, and we replace each vertex of gamma 1 with a copy of gamma 2, and the edges of gamma 1 by all of the edges joining corresponding copies of gamma 2. And then we can give a very technical, precise definition of what that means for when we have edges, but let me skip over that because I think it's much more intuitive, the word definition, and I'll give a picture example, which hopefully will make it clear. So here's a picture of how this composition or lexicographic product works. If you're not familiar with it, we have our graph gamma 1, our first graph, and I'm going to color the edges for the purposes of this example, just to make it very clear which graph is which. I have my second graph gamma 2, and what I do is I blow up the first graph. So I'm just enlarging it and expand. So I'm expanding each of the vertices and making each of the edges really fat. And then in each of these big vertices, I'm going to put a copy of gamma 2. And then in place of each of these big fat blue edges, I'm going to put every possible edge joining the corresponding copies of gamma 2. So this is the lexicographic product of these two graphs. And one of the reasons why it's called a wreath product is maybe clear, because it is also called a wreath product of graphs, as well as the wreath product of groups, is maybe clear from this picture, is that you end up getting something, if you do this on cycles, you end up getting something that looks a lot like a wreath sort of structure. Okay, so as I said, this is now usually referred to as either the lexicographic product or the wreath product of these two graphs rather than the composition of graphs. But Harari introduced it in this paper as the composition. Oh, and let me mention, hopefully it's clear, the automorphism group of this graph will certainly include what Harari talked about as the composition, the same kind of idea, the Gruppenkranz. We can permute the copies of gamma 2 according to any automorphism of gamma 1. So we can move them around in a cycle, in that 5 cycle, or we can reflect through the vertical axis, for example. But also independently, we can use any automorphism of gamma 2. We can do an automorphism of gamma 2 to this copy. We can do a different automorphism of gamma 2 to that copy, and so on as we choose. The real issue that we need to make sure of in the wreath product is that the copies of gamma 2 are preserved. So a copy of gamma 2 has to map to a copy of gamma 2. As long as you do that, you're in the wreath product of the two permutation groups. Okay. And so this construction that Harari came up with certainly does have the effect that the wreath product of the automorphism groups of these graphs is sitting inside the automorphism group of the lexicographic product of these two graphs. He did know, so as I said, the Gruppenkranz requires rows to map to rows. And so in the context of our automorphisms of our lexicographic product, copies of gamma 2 have to map to copies of gamma 2. Now, Harari already noticed when he did this that if both of your graphs are complete, then it turns out that your lexicographic product will also be complete. And then its automorphism group will not be the wreath product of the automorphism groups of the two graphs. So for example, here, if I had gamma 1 being K5 and gamma 2 being K3, then I end up with a complete graph. Gamma 1, the lexicographic product of gamma 1 and gamma 2 is the complete graph on 15 vertices. And I could, for example, interchange these two vertices while leaving everything else the same. My automorphism group is the symmetric group, so I can do absolutely anything I like, but this is in particular something I can do, and that clearly does not preserve the copies of gamma 2. This copy of gamma 2 is partly getting left alone and partly getting mapped to a different copy. So again, that's the key feature of the wreath product, is that it has to preserve the copies of the little graph. And if it doesn't, then we're not, our automorphism group is not the wreath product. It's got extra stuff in there. So we know that if we use Harari's idea to create this lexicographic product of graphs, we definitely have the wreath product of the automorphism groups in the automorphism group of our new graph. But the question is, could we get something more? And here's an example where we could get something more. So Harari stated in this same paper his what he thought was a theorem, which was the automorphism group of the composition of two graphs is permutationally equivalent to the composition of their automorphism groups if and only if not both graphs are complete. So he missed some points. Certainly empty graphs are also counterexamples, but maybe he wasn't worried about that. Maybe he was thinking of connected graphs. But I'm going to give another example, which is actually, does involve a disconnected graph still, but generalizes significantly of a problem with his idea. So suppose we take our first graph to be the complete bipartite graph K33, and our second graph to be two disconnected vertices. Then it turns out that the lexicographic product is the complete bipartite graph K66. So again, let's see how that works. We have K33, I've blown it up already. And now my next step, I'm going to put copies of the empty graph on two vertices inside each of those big vertices of my first graph. And now I'm going to replace each of these big fat blue edges with every possible edge connecting copies of my second graph gamma 2. And what I'll get is the complete bipartite graph K66. And again, remember, these are my copies of my original gamma 2, but I can certainly mess them up with while still creating an automorphism of my graph by, say, exchanging these two vertices and leaving everything else alone. This will be an automorphism of my graph that does not preserve the copies of gamma 2, and therefore my automorphism group of this new graph is not the wreath product of the automorphism groups of the two graphs I started with. So Harari's theorem was not correct, and this was noticed by Sabidussi. So I'm going to move into Sabidussi's work now. So it was noticed very quickly by Sabidussi. You may recall I said that Harari's paper came out in the Duke Journal in 1959, still in the same year. So this was really quick turnaround. And still in the Duke Journal, Sabidussi published a correction, and he also introduced the term lexicographic multiplication for this product, replacing the term composition for this graph product. Before I state his result, I need a couple of definitions. First of all, two vertices of graph are false twins if their open neighborhoods are equal. So these are two vertices that are not adjacent to each other, but share exactly the same adjacencies. And they're true twins if their closed neighborhoods are equal. So almost exactly the same as false twins, but they have to actually be adjacent to each other to be true twins. So with that definition and one other, so this is where we start getting into the infinite graph theory. For a graph is almost locally finite if only a finite number of its vertices have infinite valency. So we need that because that turns out to be one of the preconditions, but it's going to disappear pretty quickly. So don't worry too much about that particular definition. So Sabidussi's 1959 result was that if your first graph is almost locally finite and your second graph is actually finite, then the automorphism group of the lexicographic product will be exactly the wreath product of the automorphism groups, which is what Harari was trying to get, if and only if two conditions hold. First of all, if X, the first graph, has false twins, then the second graph has to be connected. And if X, the first graph, has true twins, then the second graph, Y, has to be connected. Sorry, its complement has to be connected. So I'm going to, in a moment, get into why these conditions are necessary. But before I do that, I want to mention a little bit about Sabidussi. This is a good Canadian connection again for this work. He spent most of his career at the Université de Montréal. He's actually 91 years old, and as far as I know, and as far as Wikipedia knows, still alive, although he hasn't been actively working for the last 10 years or so, at least, I think. But yeah, he was clearly an fairly early pioneer in graph theory in terms of its development. And he was in a department that was heavily interested in topology. And he discovered pretty early in his career, apparently, that if he used G for graphs, then the topologists in his department weren't very interested in his results. But once he started calling them X's and Y's, then they sounded more like topological spaces, and they paid more attention to his talks. So in Sabidussi's work, X's and Y's are almost always graphs. Okay, so with that digression, let me explain why this condition is necessary, and then I'll explain the other one, but the explanations are very similar. So let's suppose that this condition is not fulfilled, so that we have X has false twins, but Y is not connected. All right, so our big graph X has false twins, so it has these two vertices that I've blown up into big copies, and they have all of the same neighbors. They're not adjacent to each other, but otherwise they have all of the same neighbors. And as usual in the lexicographic product, I'm going to replace each of these vertices with copies of Y. So here are some copies of Y. And remember, Y, I'm assuming, is disconnected. So it has more than one connected component. I've drawn it as though it has three, but all we care about is it has more than one. Okay, well, we can get an automorphism of this lexicographic product that does not preserve the copies just by picking a particular connected component of Y and picking the corresponding connected component of Y down here. I don't actually necessarily have to pick the corresponding one, but I do have to pick an isomorphic one. And if I just exchange those two copies, then because these graphs are false twins, they will have exactly the same adjacencies everywhere else. And so switching these two copies, since they aren't adjacent to anything else in Y, switching these two copies doesn't impact anything. I will get an automorphism. My edges and my non-edges will all be preserved. So this is why if X has false twins, we can't have Y being disconnected. So the other condition was that if X has true twins, then the complement of Y has to be connected. And again, it's a very similar reason. So now if we have true twins, all that changes is that these two vertices are adjacent in X, but have all of the same neighbors outside X. And these are now the connected components of Y complement, means we have every possible edge between them. And again, I can pick a connected component of Y complement that's in and pick the same connected component in each of these two copies and switch them. And this will be an automorphism of my graph, of my lexicographic product. So these conditions of Sabidussi's are in fact really necessary in order to get that the automorphism group of the lexicographic product really is the wreath product of the automorphism groups. And of course, he also proved that they were sufficient. But this is the only problems that can arise. So 2 years later, still in the Duke Journal, Sabidussi managed to improve his result by weakening those preconditions on X and Y. So remember, he said that X had to be almost locally finite and Y had to be finite. Well, 2 years later, he proved this as long as X is non-empty and Y has the property that any two vertices have fewer than the order of Y mutual neighbors, then, which is certainly true in finite graphs, which was his previous condition, then we get the same condition. The other thing Sabidussi did in this 1961 paper was he thought a bit more about this lexicographic product or composition that Harari had introduced. And he thought, why not generalize it a bit, right? In this product, we're blowing up X and then we're replacing each vertex of X with a copy of some fixed graph Y. Well, Sabidussi asked, why do we insist that we replace every vertex of X with the same graph? Why couldn't we replace it with a bunch of different vertices with different graphs? So this was the idea of the X join of graphs. So X is going to be the first graph, and we take an X join of graphs. We take a collection of graphs Y sub X, where X is runs through the vertices of that first graph. So this is a collection of graphs indexed by the vertices of X. Then the X join of this collection of graphs is the graph we get by replacing the vertex little x with a copy of the graph that was indexed by that vertex. And then we do exactly the same thing with the edges as before. Again, we can define that more precisely about when we get edges and when we don't get edges, but the picture is, I think, the easier thing to understand, and it's very similar to the previous picture. So suppose I'm again going to let X be a 5 cycle, but I've labeled the vertices of X now just to be very clear about which vertex is going to be replaced with which other graph. And I'm going to choose Y0, the graph that goes in that 0 spot, to be just a K1. Y1 is going to be 2 vertices, and Y2, Y3, and Y4 will be the same graph as previously. And the idea, again, is just the same. I blow up X, and in the 0, where 0 vertex was, I stick Y0. Where the 1 vertex was, I stick Y1. And where the 2, 3, and 4 vertices were, I'm sticking Y2, Y3, and Y4. And again, I replace these big fat blue edges then by every possible edge between the corresponding copies of those graphs. So this is the X join of graphs, and that was the other really new idea that Sabidussi introduced in this 1961 paper. So that brings me to the work of Hemminger, who was the next significant contributor to this. So I'm going to skip the first couple of results of Hemminger because I'm not going to give the details of them because really the right result was in his third paper, but I'll tell you just a little bit about what he did in the first paper and the second thing. So in 1966, still in the Duke Journal, Hemminger published a paper in which he claimed he had necessary and sufficient conditions for the automorphism group of the lexicographic product of two graphs to be the wreath product, unless we had false twins and Y was disconnected, or we have true twins and Y is connected. So remember, Sabidussi made conditions on X and Y before he could state that result. Hemminger got rid of the conditions on X and Y. But unfortunately, he missed a subtlety. So he published an errata in 1967. And in his errata, he still did require an assumption on X, not on Y, but on X. It was on Y, not on X. And then in the 1968 paper, he was able to find necessary and sufficient conditions and some broader results. And this paper he published in the 5th volume of the Journal of Combinatorial Theory. So this is before it split into A and B. He published this there. So let's talk about his results. So first I need some definitions again. He wanted to talk about when he wanted to have a name for the automorphisms that were good in this context, and the automorphisms that were not so good in this context. So if we have a lexicographic product of graphs and we have an automorphism in that lexicographic product, then he decided we should call it natural if it does what we want it to do. If for every vertex of our first graph, there's another vertex of our first graph such that the copy of the little graph goes from the first vertex that came from the first vertex maps to the copy of the little graph that goes to the second vertex. So it's preserving copies of our second graph. And if it doesn't do that, then we'll call it unnatural. So if all of the automorphisms are natural, that's exactly what we want. If there's any unnatural, then that's not what we want. And he also wanted to generalize this idea of twins in a way. So a subset of vertices, he's called externally related in our graph if they have exactly the same neighbors outside of that set of vertices itself. So, and if any two vertices in A have exactly the same neighbors outside A, they're externally related. So not only are twins externally related, whether they're true twins or false twins, they're still externally related. But also, if we take any copy of Y in a lexicographic product, that is externally related because they have exactly the same neighbors outside of Y itself. All of those vertices do. Okay. So in order to eliminate all of those preconditions on X and Y that were in Sabidussi's work, we need to introduce and understand two other kinds of obstructions that can arise in these infinite graphs that can prevent them, well, that can mean that they have unnatural automorphisms. So the first obstruction is something that Hemminger calls inverting X-points. So suppose that we have a lexicographic product and both of the original graphs have more than one vertex. And suppose that the first graph has a vertex that is either isolated or it's complete. And suppose that Y is isomorphic to the X join of a bunch of graphs. And almost all of those graphs are actually isomorphic to the graph Y that we started with. So it's isomorphic to an X join of a bunch of copies of itself and one other thing. And that one other thing is replacing the vertex that's either isolated or complete. So this can clearly only happen if Y is infinite. If this happens, then we call X an inverting X point of gamma. And when this happens, it turns out there is, I call it unnatural, but I shouldn't have called it natural. That's a bad term because it's an unnatural automorphism. In fact, that's the whole point, that fixes a particular copy of Y and swaps some other copies of Y that aren't really copies of Y around. So this is an additional obstruction. Let me give a picture that will hopefully make clearer what's going on. So this is just an example, but I think it illustrates the point. So let's suppose X, it has to have an isolated or complete vertex. So here's its isolated vertex, little x, and it's just got these three vertices. And Y is going to be the infinite lexicographic product of X with itself as many times as you like. Well, infinitely many times. So there are other ways to do this, but this is one way to get an inverting X point. So in order to get the lexicographic product of X with Y, I take a copy of X and blow it up. So here's my copy of X that's blown up, and I replace each of these vertices with a copy of Y, and each copy of Y looks like, well, it's got a copy of X inside it. And then each of those has a copy of X inside them, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to draw the copies of Y inside these two copies, and I'll explain why in a moment. And that's because, so remember this corresponds to the vertex X, and actually so does this. And what I'm going to do for this automorphism, I'm going to fix this particular, everything that's inside here is going to get fixed pointwise. And these things are going to get swapped with these things out here. And because everything is infinite, we can do this. And this will be an automorphism of our graph. Right, there's no edges that I haven't drawn. So this will be a lovely automorphism of our graph. Inside each of these blobs is another copy of Y. So these things are isomorphic to each other. I can swap them around, and everything, all of the edges and non-edges are preserved. But I haven't preserved copies of Y, the copies of Y that I started with, because I started with just 3 copies of Y. This one, and this one. And this one didn't get preserved. Part of it got fixed and part of it got swapped out. So this is an unnatural automorphism that arises when we have an inverting X point. So this is the first kind of obstruction that we can get. In order to talk about the second obstruction, I need some more definitions. I'm going to skim through these a bit quickly because I want to, again, hopefully give you the picture of the obstruction will be more illuminating than the definitions, but let me try and get through these definitions nonetheless. So if we have 2 graphs and a map from one to the other, then Hemminger called it a smorphism, which was short for strong homomorphism, if it preserves not only edges, but non-edges as well. So homomorphisms typically preserve edges. He wanted to define something that also preserved non-edges. And if you have one of these, then you can create a quotient. So let M be a partition of the vertices of our graph, such that for every element of M, the induced subgraph on those vertices is externally related. If we can do that, then you can define a quotient graph, which is actually the quotient of a smorphism, just by identifying. So we've got each of these blobs that are externally related, and we're just going to shrink each of them down to a single point and put edges between them when we had every possible edge between those corresponding copies. Yeah, so this quotient graph really is a quotient of this smorphism that he has defined. So here's the other obstruction. If we have a proper partition of our vertices and the subgraphs induced by the elements of that partition are externally related, and we have a smorphism that's onto and that gives us some isomorphisms, and at least one of these isomorphisms is unnatural, then it turns out that we get an unnatural automorphism of the whole graph. So again, let's look at a picture of an example. So in this case, I'm going to let my X be a graph that has 2 isolated vertices and a path of length 4. And Y is going to be the iterated lexicographic product of a path of length 4 with itself infinitely many times. So if I take the lexicographic product of X with Y, then I'm going to get these two isolated vertices and this path of length 4. And inside each of these, I have a copy of Y again. And the automorphism that we're going to get in this case is going to be, I'm going to fix this vertex and I'm going to swap this copy of Y with these 4 copies of Y. And these are isomorphic because all I did here was I really just added 1 extra P4 to the wreath product, but that doesn't make a difference when we're dealing with an infinite wreath product. These things are isomorphic, so I can swap these 2 copies, and as it happened, I was able to leave something else alone. This was my unnatural isomorphism that led to an unnatural automorphism of my original graph. So this is the other thing, the other obstruction, the other thing that can go wrong. And this is the one that Hemminger didn't notice in his first paper that led to his errata. So the theorem that he ended up with looks like this. If we have graphs X and Y, then the automorphism group of their lexicographic product is the wreath product of their automorphism groups, if and only if the 2 conditions, the 2 basic conditions that Sabidussi noticed have to take place. We can't have an inverting A point for where A is a subgraph of X, an externally related subgraph of X. So that was obstruction 1 that I talked about from Hemminger's work. And we can't have obstruction 2 that I talked about. So those 4 things are the only things that can go wrong, even with infinite graphs. Okay. And he got a similar result then for the automorphism group of the X join of graphs. The thing that if we're talking about the automorphism group of the X join of graphs, and we want to say that it has all of the possible natural automorphisms that you would get from automorphisms of X and automorphisms of Y, then it kind of only makes sense to, well, it's pretty clear that you won't get a bunch of automorphisms that come from automorphisms of X unless the corresponding copies of Y happen to be isomorphic. Right? If we have an automorphism of X that takes a vertex V to a vertex W, but the copy YV is not isomorphic to YW, then that won't give us automorphisms of the lexicographic product. So with some additional assumptions about copies of Y being isomorphic, certain of the graphs in our family of graphs Y being isomorphic to each other, he came up with a nice theorem about the automorphisms of an X join. And that is, so the automorphism group consists of exactly the natural automorphisms induced by the automorphism group of X, and all of those automorphisms, if and only if the following hold. So this is the condition I was just discussing. Whenever we have an automorphism of X that maps a vertex little x to a vertex Y, the corresponding copies of Y have to be isomorphic in order for that automorphism to induce automorphisms in the lexicographic product. And then we have the Sabidussi conditions. If X and Y are false twins, then the graphs they're replaced with have to be connected. If X and Y are true twins, then the complements of the graphs they're replaced by have to be connected. And then the two Hemminger conditions. If we have an externally related subgraph, then we don't have an inverting A point for that externally related subgraph A, and the other condition, that obstruction 2. Okay, so that brings me to the paper that I did with Ted. And our first goal in this was to generalize Hemminger's and Sabidussi's work to graphs where we had colors on the edges. And it turned out that this was too easy, sadly, for us, that basically their results still went through exactly as written. All of their proofs worked exactly as written. And so this wasn't very interesting, except that in some sense, it's maybe a more natural setting for the whole idea, because instead of talking about false twins and true twins and having those sort of two separate conditions, we can talk about K-twins and the K complement. So here, I'm going to call a pair of vertices K-twins if they have an edge between them of color K and have all of the same neighbors of every color outside of each other. And the K complementive graph is going to be the graph we get just by deleting all of the edges of color K. So instead of having those two conditions about false twins and true twins, we can just replace it with this one condition that has to apply for every color K that we're using. But this one condition is just that if we have a pair of K twins, then the K complement of Y is connected. And then the other two conditions, those two obstructions of Hemminger's, are still required. So there was nothing really novel, as I say, in this piece of what we wanted to do. But in addition to color graphs, another way that lexicographic products have seen increasing use over the years is for directed graphs. So we were wondering, how do these results apply to directed graphs? I don't want to go into the details because it gets a bit complicated when we get into this, but it turns out that for finite, even color digraphs, Sabidussi's and Hemminger's result is still true, but this one is a little bit more interesting because there are some more technical details in the proof that we did have to deal with. Their proofs do not suffice as written to prove this. And if you talk about infinite color digraphs, it turns out there are two other situations, two other obstructions that can arise. And again, I don't want to go into this because I want to get through the rest of my material, and it's pretty technical, the other issues that can come up. So some useful corollaries to this work are, for example, a little bit more along the lines of the results that Sabidussi proved in the first place. So I'm going to make some preconditions on X and Y, and then have a very nice statement in the end. So if X is finite as a color digraph, and Y is not a proper subdigraph of itself, then we get that the automorphism group of the lexicographic product is the wreath product of the automorphism groups. If and only if for every K, if X has K twins, then the K complement of Y is connected. And we can replace X finite really isn't necessary, but the conditions get a little more complicated with digraphs. So we could say, some other things a lot more general than that, but they get a bit complicated. But also, if we are in the context of color graphs, we can replace this with any X. So if X is a graph rather than a digraph, then we can take any X, and as long as Y is not a proper subdigraph of itself, then we get this condition. So one other particularly useful situation, especially when we're talking about algebraic graph theory, where lexicographic products arise, is for vertex transitive graphs. And maybe one of the most interesting results, as far as I'm concerned, in that 2009 paper that I wrote with Ted, is that if you have two graphs that are lexicographic products and finite, and we take our two graphs are vertex transitive, and we take their lexicographic product, and they're both finite as well, and the result is neither complete nor empty, then it turns out that if we don't get the automorphism group of the lexicographic product being the wreath product of the automorphism groups, then it's because we made a bad choice of where we split it up as a lexicographic product. There was a better choice where we could have split it up, where we would get that the automorphism group is exactly what we want. So we could have chosen instead gamma 1 primed and gamma 2 primed instead of gamma 1 and gamma 2, so that our graph gamma can also be written as the lexicographic product of these graphs instead of the graphs we started with, and its automorphism group is the wreath product of the automorphism groups of these two graphs. Generally speaking, it works with the graphs we started with, but sometimes you might have to make a different choice. And in fact, it turns out that when you have to make a different choice, it's because gamma 1 looked like something like gamma 3 wreath K M, say, and gamma 2 is K wreath gamma 4, something like that. And then these two complete pieces should really be joined together, morally speaking, because they're going to make a bigger complete graph in there. And then what we should have chosen is gamma 1, or is to have this whole complete piece in either gamma 1 or gamma 2, and then we'd be fine. So that's essentially the way it can go wrong. And of course, instead of having these complete pieces, we could have them empty pieces. And again, we can have, that will lead to the same problem. So I want to spend a few moments on lexicographic products and Cayley graphs. So if you don't know what a Cayley graph is, I've given the definition here, but I'm just doing one slide on this, so I'm not going to go through the definition or dwell on this. But the point that I want to make here is that whether or not a Cayley graph is a lexicographic product is actually easy to detect if you just have the connection set, because it's a lexicographic product if and only if you can find some subgroup H of your group G, and the connection set, if you ignore the elements that are actually in H, the rest of the connection set is a union of right cosets of that subgroup. If that happens, then your Cayley graph does turn out to be a lexicographic product. And the reason I wanted to mention this is that this allows us to create a generalized or to think about a generalized lexicographic product in the context of Cayley graphs, where if we have two subgroups, K and H of G, where K is sitting inside H, and again, we're going to take the elements of the connection set that are not in H, and if that turns out to be a union of right cosets not of H anymore, but of some smaller, possibly smaller subgroup K, then this is a generalization of the idea of wreath products, of lexicographic products. And so the kind of thing that we can get in this sort of example is, so these are the cosets of our bigger group K, and inside of those we have cosets of our littler group H. And I'm going to draw this as though everything has three elements in it. And maybe this subgraph sitting inside this copy of H might be a 9 cycle, so it might look like this. which looks kind of messy in this particular kind of drawing, but we could get something like that. And of course, we'll get a 9 cycle in each of the other copies as well. And then the generalized lexicographic product, unlike the lexicographic product where we'd have to connect everything between these big blobs, in the generalized lexicographic product, we just know that for any of these little blobs, we have either all possible edges or no edges to any of these little blobs that are in other big blobs. I know that's very technical language talking about blobs, but this is the kind of thing that can arise. This is generalization of the lexicographic product. If H and K are the same group, then we get the regular lexicographic product. And the main reason I wanted to mention that was just to briefly mention that there is a recent preprint by Bagherian and Memarzadeh in which they define a generalization of the lexicographic product, and its automorphism group has a very similar relationship to the generalized wreath product of permutation groups that was introduced by Evdokimov and Ponomarenko in 2012 that I've been talking about in terms of the relationship between the regular lexicographic product and the regular wreath product. So I'm going to just state their definition there, but I realize that my time is coming to an end, so I'm just going to leave that there. The main reference that I want to leave you with is this paper of mine with Ted. It does contain the references to all of the other papers, except of course that last paper that I was preprint that I was just talking about, and does a fairly decent job, I think, of explaining some of that history, and it's freely available online through the electronic journal, so it should be easy to find. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful. Do we have questions for Joy?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So just in the Sabidussi's theorem, you sort of explained the necessity for these conditions. Can you give an idea of why the sufficiency holds?
Well, I mean, really, it's all about what else can go wrong, and particularly in the finite case, it's not that hard to show that nothing else can go wrong. I'm not going to be able to give a sketch of that off the top of my head, but yeah, really, especially in the finite case, nothing else can go wrong.
Okay, sure.
I have a maybe slightly related question,
Mhm.
which is, so let's say with any of these journals, let's say with the Sabidussi one, let's say you're in a situation where something does go wrong. Can you say much, given the graphs you're using, can you say much about like how much bigger the automorphism group gets, or like you get qualitative information there?
Yeah, so I mean, you can to a certain extent, because certainly, yeah. So for example, if you have these two, so if we have one of the Sabidussi type of obstructions, where do I have that? Yeah, one of these type of obstructions, then, well, exactly what you get going wrong. So this is basically the only thing that can happen in the finite case. What goes wrong is we get every possible way of exchanging these two copies of Y.
Yeah.
It's these two components of Y. And that's really all that you get. Those are the only extra things you get. So really, yeah, what you get is the least you might expect that you get. And the same kind of thing happens in these infinite cases, that these infinite obstructions that, so what we get here is basically the least you can think that you would get. We have these extra automorphisms that switch these copies of things around while leaving pieces of the graph. But I mean, that does significantly blow up the automorphism group. This is not a small increase to the size.
Right. Other questions?
I have maybe another question. I was just curious about the lexicographic or the generalized lexicographic product. How is that something that comes up somewhere else? Like, is that I don't know.
So
it doesn't seem like an obvious generalization of this.
So this idea, I mean, the reason this idea comes up if in the work that I've done on graphs that are isomorphic, that are Cayley graphs on more than one group, these generalized lexicographic products arise there, particularly in Cayley graphs on P groups that are also Cayley graphs on that are Cayley graphs on a cyclic group and also some other P group. We can get we can get these generalized lexicographic products. So they're kind of they arise naturally in that sort of context. I'm not aware of other contexts in which they have arisen naturally. This definition by Bagherian and Memarzadeh is much more general, and yeah, I don't know of a place where these things have arisen in this level of generality.
Okay.